What Came Out of the Bathroom Drain, 1998. Sinchon, Seoul. Part 1. The Arrival. Chapter 1. September, 1998. The autumn of 1998 was particularly cruel in Seoul. The city sprawled beneath a gray sky, its millions of inhabitants moving through their routines with mechanical precision, unaware that some corners held secrets far darker than any forecast could predict. Park Min-ho was not one of Seoul's fortunate ones. At 23 years old, he had already tasted the bitterness of financial struggle more than most. His parents, who owned a small farm in Andong, nearly 4 hours south of the capital, could barely send him 300,000 won each month. It was not enough. Tuition alone consumed most of it, leaving him to cover rent, food, and transportation through part-time work at a convenience store. The convenience store job paid minimum wage. He worked nights, stocking shelves, operating the register, cleaning floors. His shifts often ran from 4 in the afternoon until 11 at night, sometimes longer during holidays. By the time he arrived back at his previous goshiwon, exhaustion had settled into his bones like a permanent tenant. That previous goshiwon, located in a slightly better neighborhood, had cost him 180,000 won per month, a sum that represented nearly 2/3 of his monthly stipend. After 6 months of barely scraping by, after pawning some books and selling blood plasma whenever possible, he had fallen 3 months behind on rent. The landlord had given him an ultimatum: find the money by the end of September, or leave. Min-ho had chosen to leave, rather than face the shame and the increasing hostility of the landlord's daily visits. September 29th found him on the streets with everything he owned in a battered suitcase purchased from a second-hand shop for 15,000 won. He had wandered through neighborhoods he could barely afford to pass through, searching desperately for something cheaper, something possible. It was near midnight when he turned down a narrow alley in Sinchon and saw the sign, Sinchon Dream House goshiwon, 150,000 won month. The number seemed impossible, too good to be true. Min-ho stood before the 3-story concrete building, its exterior stained with decades of grime and pollution, its paint peeling in long strips like the skin of something dying slowly. But the number was real. He climbed the worn stone steps and rang the buzzer. After several minutes, a voice, thin and accented with age, crackled through the intercom, asking for his business. He explained he was looking for a room. There was a long pause, then the sound of an electronic lock clicking open. The interior was worse than the exterior suggested. The stairwell smelled of mold, cigarette smoke, and something chemical. Cleaning supplies trying unsuccessfully to mask deeper odors. Bare bulbs, their light sickly yellow, illuminated each step. Kim Ji-won appeared on the second-floor landing. She was a woman in her mid-60s, lean and angular, her hair steel gray pulled back in a severe bun. Her face contained no warmth, no recognition of youth or beauty, or the desperation that surely showed on Min-ho's face. She looked at him as a landlord looks at potential profit, with calculation and indifference. "You have money?" she asked immediately. "I have a deposit," Min-ho lied. He had 14,000 won in his pocket, barely enough to buy food for a week. "No deposit," Kim Ji-won said. "1 month's rent in advance, 15th of every month. You're late even 1 day, you're out." Min-ho nodded rapidly. Yes, of course. That's no problem." She led him up to the 3rd floor without another word. The hallway was long and narrow, 8 doors lining both sides. The lighting was no better than downstairs. Several doors bore numbers. Others were unmarked, their function uncertain. She stopped before a door marked 302 and unlocked it with a key from her enormous keyring. The room was 3 pyong, about 35 square meters, but that was generous. A single bed frame with a thin mattress, a small desk barely large enough for a laptop, and a wardrobe that looked as though it might collapse if anyone actually placed clothing inside it. In the corner, a bathroom so small that standing in it with the door closed required holding one's breath. "Bathroom is shared between 3 rooms if you need something major," Kim Ji-won said flatly. "But you use this one for personal business. You clean it yourself. The drain gets blocked, you fix it." "That's fine," Min-ho said quickly. "This is perfect. This is really perfect." Something flickered across Kim Ji-won's face. Recognition, perhaps, of how desperate he was. It might have been pity. It might have been something else. She handed him the key and left without ceremony. Min-ho sat on the bed and felt it sag dangerously beneath him. He lay back and stared at the water stains on the ceiling, at the cracks in the plaster that resembled geological formations from another world. He had done it. He had found a place. It was not much, but it was shelter. He did not yet know that he had also found a tomb. Chapter 2. The First Night and the First Signs. His first shower in the goshiwon was hurried and uncomfortable. The water pressure was weak, barely more than a trickle, and the water temperature fluctuated wildly between scalding and ice cold. The tiles around the small bathtub were yellowed and cracked, a few pieces missing entirely, exposing the gray concrete beneath. The drain was the first truly disturbing thing he noticed. It was a simple metal grate, perhaps 3 inches in diameter, stained dark with rust and age. But from it emanated an odor that seemed to contain layers of time. Stagnant water, yes, but also something else, something organic, something that had been sitting in darkness for far too long. When Minho stepped out of the shower and looked down, he saw hair tangled in the grate. Long hair, black hair, strands of it, caught in the mesh, dripping. Minho's hair was short. He kept it in a simple military style, just long enough to prove he was no longer in mandatory service. This hair, this black, feminine hair that reached at least to shoulder length, belonged to someone else, perhaps the previous tenant. He grabbed tissue paper and pulled the hair out. It was longer than he expected, and heavy with water, and it came away in a clump. He felt a strange revulsion as he held it, something instinctive that made his stomach tighten. He threw it quickly into the trash and washed his hands twice. The smell from the drain seemed stronger after that disturbance. That first night, despite his exhaustion, Minho found sleep difficult. The room was unfamiliar, the sounds of the building strange. Every floorboard creak, every distant voice, seemed amplified in the darkness. Outside the small window, the neon signs of nearby shops cast alternating red and blue shadows across the cheap curtains. Around 2 a.m, he heard it, water running. His eyes snapped open. He lay very still, listening. The sound came from the bathroom. Water, definitely. Running water. But he hadn't left the sink on. He was certain of it. He had checked. Paranoid habit from childhood. A fear of wasting water he couldn't afford. Checked the bathroom twice before attempting sleep. Minho got up and opened the bathroom door. The darkness inside was complete. He fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The bare bulb illuminated the small space in harsh yellow light. The sink was dry. The shower was dry. But he could hear water, coming from the drain. Not quite running, he realized, standing closer. More like trickling. A slow, wet sound, as though water was moving through the pipes beneath the floor. He stood listening to it for perhaps 2 minutes before it stopped. After 30 seconds of silence, he returned to bed, telling himself it was probably just the building's aging plumbing settling. He did not sleep again that night. He lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building, footsteps in hallways, a door opening and closing, the faint murmur of a television in a neighboring room, and wondered about the hair in the drain. Chapter 3. The pattern becomes clear. October arrived with a cold that bit at fingers and noses. Heating in the goshiwon was minimal. Residents relied on electric heaters and their own clothing layers. Minho could see his breath in the bathroom on his first morning of the new month. The hair had returned. He knew immediately, even before fully waking. The smell was stronger, sharper, somehow. He padded to the bathroom, turned on the light, and there it was. A nest of long black hair tangled in the drain grate, fresh-looking, wet, as though placed there overnight. Minho tried to convince himself that this was normal. Hair accumulated in drains. He had cleaned it out yesterday, or the day before. Time blurred together in this goshiwon, so of course it might accumulate again. Perhaps there was more than one person on this floor. Perhaps hair from other bathrooms had somehow migrated through the pipes, but the amount seemed excessive. And the way it was arranged, tightly wound, as though deliberately placed, seemed odd. He cleaned it out again, using tissue paper, and forcing himself not to think about the texture, the weight, the fact that this hair was definitely human, definitely from a woman, and definitely not his. The odor from the drain seemed to follow him throughout the day. At the convenience store, stocking shelves with instant ramen, he caught himself thinking about it. During a lecture on microeconomics, he found his attention wandering back to that dark hole, that source of inexplicable stench. He convinced himself to buy a bottle of drain cleaner from the store, a harsh chemical formula promising to dissolve buildup and eliminate odors. That night, he poured the entire bottle down the drain, watching the liquid foam and bubble, smelling the chemical burn. He let it sit for the recommended time, then flushed it with hot water. The smell lessened, marginally. Chapter 4. The accumulation. What began as an annoyance became an obsession of sorts. Each morning, without fail, hair returned to the drain. Long black hair. Always black. Always long. In varying quantities, but always present. October 5th. A small handful. Perhaps enough to fill a fist. October 8th. More substantial. A clump that required him to wear gloves while removing it, not trusting his bare hands to touch it. October 12th. So much that it partially blocked the drain entirely. Water pooled in the bathtub until he cleared the blockage. October 15th. The amount was roughly similar to previous days, but it seemed stickier, heavier, as though it had been soaked in something thicker than water. And the smell. God, the smell. It had evolved from a simple odor of stagnation into something more complex. Stagnant water, yes, but layered beneath it was something organic, something that suggested decay, decomposition, things breaking down in darkness and wet places. On October 8th, Minho took the unprecedented step of purchasing multiple bottles of bleach. He decided to pour one directly down the drain, to actually attempt to sterilize it completely. He did this at night, after his convenience store shift, watching the bleach foam and bubble, drowning the dark hole in chemical whiteness. The smell of bleach filled the small bathroom and began creeping into the room. He left the window open despite the cold, standing outside the door, coughing at the fumes. When the bleach had fully drained and the smell had somewhat dissipated, he felt hopeful for the first time since moving in. Perhaps this was the solution. Perhaps tomorrow morning, the drain would be clean. The next morning, black hair was back in the drain. Chapter 5. The landlady's evasion. Minho's paranoia grew. He began asking subtle questions to the other residents he encountered in the hallway. Most were silent or evasive. An older man named Kim Tae-hoon, who lived in room 301 and worked at a construction site, simply said, "Don't think about it. Just pay your rent and mind your business." A younger woman, Park Sun-young, who worked at a restaurant, seemed nervous when he brought it up and quickly excused herself. On October 5th, desperate for answers, or at least confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind, Minho descended to the second floor and knocked on the landlady's door. Kim Ji-won answered after a long delay, and her expression immediately hardened when she saw who it was. "What?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm sorry to bother you," Minho said carefully, "but there's a problem with the bathroom drain in my room. Hair keeps accumulating there. I've cleaned it multiple times. Even used chemical drain cleaner, but it keeps coming back. I think there might be a problem with the pipes." Kim Ji-won's face went very still. A muscle in her jaw tightened. "It's your hair," she said flatly. "Clean it yourself." "But ma'am, my hair is short and I've already—" "Clean it," she repeated, and began closing the door. Minho put his hand up, not touching the door, but clearly indicating he wished to continue the conversation. "Please, I'm not trying to cause trouble. It's just that the amount of hair is excessive, and the smell is very strong. I'm wondering if perhaps there's a blockage deeper in the pipes. Or, we don't have a maintenance person," Kim Ji-won interrupted. "You want something fixed? You fix it yourself, or hire someone. That's not my responsibility." "I understand, but are you paying rent?" "Yes, ma'am. I paid on time." "Then you have no complaints," she said, and closed the door firmly. Minho stood in the hallway for a long moment, his cheeks burning with embarrassment and frustration. He returned to his room and tried to convince himself that he was overreacting. Drains were problematic. Tenants had to be self-sufficient. This was normal, but something about the interaction bothered him deeply. The landlady's immediate defensiveness, the way her face had gone careful and controlled when he mentioned the problem. It was the reaction of someone accustomed to hiding something, not someone simply dealing with a pesky maintenance issue. That night, unable to sleep, Minho lay in darkness and heard the water running in the pipes again. This time, beneath the sound of trickling water, he thought he heard something else, a sound almost like breathing, or a very faint voice, too distant to understand. He got up and put his ear against the bathroom wall. The sound stopped immediately. There was nothing but the faint hum of the building settling. He did not sleep again that night. Part 2. The Investigation, Chapter 6. A Chance Meeting. Lee Sang-woo lived in room 308, at the far end of the third-floor hallway. Minho had seen him only twice since moving in. A slight, bookish man with wire-rimmed glasses, always carrying textbooks or journals, always looking exhausted. They met properly on October 7th, in the hallway between their rooms. Minho, returning late from work, was fumbling with his key when Sang-woo emerged from his room. "Hey," Minho said, trying to sound casual. "You've been here a while, right?" Sang-woo adjusted his glasses. 6 months. Why? Just wondering if you've noticed anything weird about the building. Sang-woo's expression shifted. Something in his eyes indicated that the question had landed somewhere significant. He glanced at the nearby doors, then lowered his voice. "Like what?" "The drain in my bathroom," Minho said. "Hair keeps accumulating. Long black hair. Every single day. I've cleaned it out multiple times, used chemicals, everything. It just comes back." Sang-woo was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Come to my room for a minute." Inside room 308, which was marginally larger than Minho's but similarly sparse, Sang-woo offered tea from a small kettle and then settled into a serious expression. "You're in 302? Sang-woo asked. "Yes. That room," Sang-woo said slowly, "has had some issues. Multiple residents have lived there in the time I've been here. None stayed longer than a few months. And before me, I heard about others who came and went even faster." "What kind of issues?" "Noises, strange things, and—" Sang-woo paused, seeming to gather courage. "Disappearances." Minho set down his tea. "What do you mean, disappearances?" "There was a girl who lived in your room before you," Sang-woo said. "A few years ago. She just vanished. Left all her stuff. The landlady said she ran away or got in trouble, but I don't know. Something was off about it." "What was her name?" "I can't remember exactly. Something like Haya Jin or Hyran. Something with Jin in it. It was a while ago." Minho felt a chill move through him. "And she just disappeared?" "That's what I heard. The police came, asked some questions, and then nothing. She was never found." "And before her?" Sang-woo trailed off, seeming to debate how much to say. "I heard rumors about someone else. Someone who disappeared even before that." "What kind of rumors?" "Just that the room is unlucky, that people don't stay, that the building has bad energy." Chapter 7. The Library Discovery. The following day, October 8th, Minho went to the Yonsei University Library during a break between classes. He had a specific goal: finding newspaper archives from the early 1990s through the mid-1990s. He moved through microfiche readers with the focus of someone hunting something very specific. April 1993. He found it. The article was small, only 4 paragraphs, buried on page 6 of the local section. Young woman missing from Sinchon, Goshiwon. Jung Mi-young, age 22. A student at Yuha Women's University majoring in fine arts. Last seen on April 3, 1993. Her family filed a missing person report. Police were investigating. She was believed to have disappeared from her Goshiwon residence located on, and there was the address, the exact building where Minho now lived. His hands trembled as he scrolled through subsequent editions. April 4th, no follow-up. April 5th, nothing. Within a week, the story had disappeared from the newspaper entirely, replaced by coverage of government policy changes and celebrity gossip. He searched for 1995 next, with a vague name in mind from what Sang-woo had mentioned. Around August, there. August 1995, third-year student missing from Seoul, Goshiwon. Choi Hye-jin, age 24. English literature major at Yuha Women's University. Last seen August 15th, 1995. The article was remarkably similar to the first, down to the date format and police quote, and the address, the exact same building. Minho printed both articles on the library's ancient photocopier, his hand still shaking. He sat in the reference area for several minutes, staring at the 2 young women's faces reproduced in grainy newsprint. Jung Mi-young had a serious expression, almost formal, as though forced to smile for a school ID photo. Choi Hye-jin looked bright and vivacious, her long black hair visible even in the low-quality photo. Long black hair. Minho's stomach clenched. He gathered the photocopies and left the library, his mind racing. Chapter 8. The Collaboration Deepens. That evening, he brought the articles to Sang-woo's room. Sang-woo read them twice, his expression growing darker each time. "Jesus," Sang-woo whispered. "So it's not just rumors. These are actual cases. 2 disappearances," Minho said. "From the same building. From the same floor, I'd guess. Maybe the same room. Have you noticed anything else odd?" Sang-woo asked. "Besides the hair?" "Sounds," Minho said. "In the pipes. And the landlady reacted very strangely when I asked her about the drain problem. She practically threw me out." Sang-woo was quiet, thinking. Then he said, I hear things sometimes. Late at night, footsteps in the hallway, someone knocking on doors. But when I check, there's no one there. When does this happen? Usually between 2 and 4 in the morning. Multiple times a week. They looked at each other, the implications hanging between them like smoke. We need to do something, Sang-woo said. This is serious. We should go to the police. With what evidence? Minho asked. 2 old newspaper articles about missing girls. They'll think we're crazy. Or worse, they'll start asking questions that could get us evicted. Then what do you propose? Minho hadn't fully thought it through, but an idea was forming. We look for evidence. Physical evidence. In my drain. Chapter 9. The excavation. They decided to do it on October 12th, a Wednesday, when Kim Ji-won was known to go to the market in the early afternoon. Sang-woo purchased tools. A long, thin wire that could be used as a makeshift pipe snake, heavy rubber gloves, a flashlight, and several large plastic bags. The bathroom in room 302 was as unpleasant as ever. The smell seemed to have gotten worse, a thick, stale odor that coated the back of the throat. Accumulated hair was visible in the drain, wound around the grate in a dense mat. My God, Sang-woo muttered, pulling on the gloves. How much hair is in there? More every day, Minho said. He was also gloved, flashlight in hand. Sang-woo began pulling out the surface hair. It came away in chunks, wet and heavy. He deposited it in a plastic bag and kept going, layer after layer. The accumulated mass was far more than seemed possible. Once the initial layer was removed, Sang-woo began feeding the wire down the drain carefully, feeling for blockages. The wire went down perhaps 15 centimeters before encountering resistance. He manipulated it gently, trying to dislodge whatever was blocking the pipe. There's something down here, he said. Something solid. He pulled the wire up carefully. More hair came with it, but other things too. Small white fragments, bits of something that might have been bone, fabric, a small piece of pale cloth. Sang-woo went very still. Keep the light steady, he said quietly. Minho focused the flashlight on the drain as Sang-woo reached down with gloved fingers. He extracted a small object, a fragment of white material no larger than a fingernail. An actual fingernail, human fingernail, with what appeared to be decomposed flesh still attached to the root. The color drained from both their faces. There's more, Sang-woo said hoarsely. He pulled the wire down again, and this time emerged with longer strands of black hair. So much hair, along with more bone fragments, what appeared to be small teeth and another piece of fabric. This piece was larger, a scrap of white material with a faded blue pattern printed on it. It looked like it might have come from pajamas. The 2 young men worked methodically, though both were visibly shaken. Each extraction revealed more evidence, more fingernails, more hair, more unidentifiable fragments of what had once been human. They cataloged everything in plastic bags, their hands shaking. When they had extracted everything accessible from above the blockage, Sang-woo attempted to push the wire further, to dislodge whatever remained deeper in the pipes. After several attempts, something gave way. The water that had been pooling in the bathtub began to drain. We need to call the police, Sang-woo said, his voice barely above a whisper. Right now. This is evidence of a crime. But before Minho could respond, they heard it, the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps climbing toward the 3rd floor. The landlady, Minho whispered. They frantically gathered the bags, sealed them carefully, and were just closing the bathroom door when they heard the key in the lock of room 302's main door. Kim Ji-won stepped inside. For a moment, she didn't react. Then her eyes registered Sang-woo's gloved hands, the plastic bags, the wire on the counter. Her entire face changed. The careful neutrality vanished, replaced by something raw and terrible. Fear. What are you doing? She asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Cleaning the drain, Minho said, his voice hoarse. It was blocked. Kim Ji-won looked at the plastic bags. Then she looked at both young men in a way that suggested she could see right through them, right into their knowledge of what they had found. You need to come with me, she said finally. Both of you. Downstairs. Part 3. The Landlady's Confession, Chapter 10. The 2nd floor. Kim Ji-won's room was larger than Minho had expected, better maintained. On the walls hung photographs in simple frames, old pictures, some in color, some faded to sepia. A younger Kim Ji-won with a man who must have been her husband, a boy at various ages, a small family. Kim Ji-won gestured for them to sit. She sat across from them, suddenly looking much older than she had before, diminished, as though the facade of normalcy she'd maintained had cracked open. For a long time, she said nothing. Her eyes were closed. "I had a son," she said finally, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "His name was Kim Dong-hyun. He was born in 1970. Min-ho and Sang-woo exchanged glances but remained silent. "He was a good child," she continued. "Quiet, but good. When his father died, when Dong-hyun was 10 years old, something changed. The trauma, the doctors said. He became withdrawn, difficult, and as he got older, the problems got worse." Kim Ji-won opened her eyes and looked at them directly. "He was mentally ill. The doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia. He heard voices. He believed things that weren't true, and he became obsessed with women, specifically women with long hair. He stalked one girl in high school. The police got involved. There was an incident at school." She paused, her jaw working as though she was chewing on words she didn't want to say. "I tried to get him treatment," she said, "but treatment was expensive, and the stigma was enormous. People with mental illness were kept hidden. They were treated like they were monsters. I didn't want that for my son. I thought if I just kept him home, supported him, gave him time, he could heal." "Ma'am," Sang-woo began, but Kim Ji-won held up a hand. "I built this building," she said. "I converted the 3rd floor into rooms to rent. It was supposed to help us financially, to pay for his care, but I needed to keep Dong-hyun isolated. I needed to make sure he didn't hurt anyone, or didn't hurt anyone else." Her voice cracked on those last words. "In 1993, Kim Ji-won continued, a girl named Jung Mi-young moved into the 3rd floor. She was bright, friendly. She had very long hair. Dong-hyun saw her, and something in him, something broke. She stood up and walked to one of the photographs on the wall, a picture of a young man, late teens or early 20s, with a blank expression. One night he got out of his room. I don't know how he managed it. I thought I had secured everything, but he got out, and he went to her room." Kim Ji-won's voice had become monotone, as if reciting facts from a report she had read many times. "He killed her," she said simply. "He strangled her, and then he didn't know what to do with the body, so he put it in her bathtub and used drain cleaner to dissolve it, to get rid of the evidence." Min-ho felt his stomach drop. Sang-woo had gone rigid. "He flushed most of her remains down the drain," Kim Ji-won said. "But bones, nails, hair, those things don't dissolve completely. They got stuck in the pipes." "No," Min-ho whispered. "Yes," Kim Ji-won said. "And I hid it. I cleaned the room. I told people she had left. I disposed of her belongings. Because I couldn't admit what my son had done. I couldn't let him be taken away. What would have happened to him in prison? What would happen to me?" She turned back to face them, and her face was completely destroyed, hollowed out by years of carrying this secret. 2 years later, she continued, another girl moved into the same room. Her name was Choi Hye-jin. She had long hair, too. Very long, black hair. And Dong-hyun. He did it again. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. "I found out the next morning," Kim Ji-won said. "Blood in his room. His hands stained. He didn't even seem to fully understand what he had done. I cleaned everything. I dissolved her body the same way. I got rid of the evidence. Again." "Why?" Sang-woo asked, his voice shaking. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because he was my son!" Kim Ji-won screamed, and the sound was so raw and full of anguish that it seemed to shake the walls. "My only child. My only family. What was I supposed to do? Turn him over to be executed? Watch him rot in a cell?" She slumped back into her chair. "He couldn't help it," she said, her voice broken. "The voices made him do it. He was sick, and no one could help him. No one wanted to help him. I was all he had." "What happened to your son?" Min-ho asked, though some part of him already knew. "He killed himself," Kim Ji-won said. "January 1996. He hanged himself in his room. He couldn't live with what he had done. He left a note saying the voices wouldn't stop, that the girls came to him every night in his dreams, that he couldn't be forgiven." She looked at the plastic bags the young men had brought. "And now they keep coming back," she whispered. "In the pipes. They want to be found. They want to go home." Chapter 11. The police. They reported it to the police that same evening. Homicide detectives arrived at the goshiwon within an hour, followed by forensic teams, media personnel, and eventually the entire building became a crime scene. The drain in room 302 was carefully excavated by professionals wearing hazmat suits. Over the next 72 hours, experts extracted more than they had found. More bone fragments, more fingernail remnants, tooth fragments bearing identification marks, pieces of cloth and synthetic material from clothing, even a student ID card, heavily degraded, but still bearing the face of Young Mi Young. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to both missing women. Tests performed on Kim Ji-won's room, which police entered with a warrant, revealed physical evidence related to the crimes, traces of the chemical used to dissolve the bodies, stained materials, documentation of the missing girls, a search of the building's surrounding areas, conducted in the days following the discovery, led police to an abandoned location 20 kilometers outside the city, where Kim Ji-won had buried her son. The grave was exhumed. Skeletal remains were identified as belonging to Kim Dong-hyun. The story broke in the media with the force of an explosion. Serial killer's mother hides bodies in goshiwon drain. Seoul landlady's secret. 2 dead girls hidden for years. The story dominated Korean news for weeks. Chapter 12. The Trial. The trial of Kim Ji-won began in December 1998 and continued through the winter of 1999. She was charged with accessory to murder, concealing evidence, obstruction of justice, and preventing proper burial rites. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, true crime enthusiasts, and the families of the victims. Jung Mi-young's mother, Park Soo-ja, testified with tears streaming down her face. She described years of searching, of hope that turned gradually to despair, of not knowing what happened to her daughter, of being unable to properly grieve or conduct a memorial service because there was no body, no certainty, no closure. "I called the police dozens of times," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "They treated her disappearance like she was a runaway, like she didn't matter. And all that time, my daughter's remains were in a pipe beneath a building in Sinchon, in a drain, like trash." Choi Hee-jin's father, Choi Jin-soo, was angrier. "My daughter was a good student. She was kind. She had dreams. She wanted to be an artist. And she was murdered by a madman, and her body was destroyed by his mother to hide the crime. Where is the justice in this?" Psychiatric evaluations of Kim Dong-hyun's remains were presented. Experts testified about the nature of his illness, about how untreated schizophrenia, combined with obsessive tendencies, could create conditions for violence. Kim Ji-won's lawyer argued for leniency based on her son's mental illness, her own difficult circumstances, and her role as a caregiver, struggling without resources in a system that had failed them. The prosecution argued that regardless of her son's illness, Kim Ji-won made a conscious choice to conceal multiple crimes, to obstruct justice, and to prevent the families of the victims from obtaining closure or information. In March 1999, the judge delivered his verdict. Kim Ji-won was found guilty on all charges. However, recognizing her age, her background, and the fact that she herself had not directly perpetrated the murders, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison, rather than the prosecution's requested life sentence. The families of the victims sat in stunned silence as the verdict was read. 15 years seemed inadequate. 15 years was less time than Min Young and Hyejin had not lived past. Part 4. Aftermath and Meaning. Chapter 13. The Impact on Minho. In the months following the case's resolution, Minho found himself unable to continue living a normal life. The university had to work with him on his schedule, as attending classes became difficult. His work at the convenience store became sporadic. He moved out of the goshiwon, unable to remain in that space knowing what had occurred there. He attended the memorial services for both Young Mi Young and Choi Hyejin. He listened to their families speak about their loves, their dreams, their personalities. He learned that Young Mi Young had wanted to be an artist, that her death had silenced a creative voice that might have produced beautiful things. He learned that Choi Hyejin had been writing poetry in a private journal, verses about loneliness, about searching for belonging in a harsh city. Their lives, reduced to newspaper headlines and courtroom testimony, suddenly became real to him in a way that the cases themselves had not. He realized he had, inadvertently, become an instrument of closure for these families, that his obsessive investigation of the drain had, against all odds, provided them with answers after years of anguish. It was a heavy burden for a 23-year-old to bear. Minho began attending therapy, though affordability was a constant concern. The therapist, A woman named Dr. Lee helped him process the trauma of discovery, the feeling of responsibility, the guilt that he had moved into a room where a murdered girl had once slept. "You were not responsible for what happened," Dr. Lee told him. "You were responsible for doing what was right, once you discovered the truth. That took courage." "But I could have moved out earlier," Minho said. "If I had just chosen a different room at a different building. Those girls would still be dead, but at least I wouldn't have discovered them. At least some peace could have come to their families without my involvement." "Would you prefer not to have involved yourself?" Dr. Lee asked. "That the truth remained hidden?" Minho didn't answer, but he thought about it, many nights, lying awake in his new room in a new building. If he had not obsessed about the drain, if he had not met Sang-woo, if he had not gone to the library, would the truth ever have emerged? Would the families ever have known? The answer seemed to be no. The bodies might have remained in the pipes indefinitely, preserved in some horrible limbo. The families might have spent the rest of their lives not knowing. Chapter 14. Lee Sang-woo's Reckoning. Lee Sang-woo handled the aftermath differently. He threw himself into his studies with renewed purpose, eventually focusing his sociology thesis on the topic of institutional failure in cases of missing persons and the psychological and social impacts of delayed closure. He was careful to anonymize the case in his academic work, not out of sensitivity to Kim Ji-won's privacy. He felt she deserved none, but out of respect for the victims' families and a desire not to sensationalize their tragedy. His work was eventually published in a minor academic journal and later cited in policy discussions about missing persons reporting. It was not recognition in the way most academics sought it, but it was real, and it meant something. Sang-woo stayed in contact with Minho, though their relationship was forever marked by the shared trauma of discovery. They would see each other occasionally for coffee or lunch, and they would talk about the case in careful, measured terms, as though the incident might somehow reignite if they spoke too directly about it. "Do you ever dream about it?" Sang-woo asked Minho once, years later. "Every week," Minho said. "Sometimes multiple times in a single night. I dream about the drain, about opening it and finding other things. Sometimes I dream about the girls, about them trying to communicate with me from the pipes." "Me too," Sang-woo said, "though the dreams are getting less frequent, less vivid. I think my mind is trying to process it, to file it away as something that happened, not something that's still happening." Chapter 15. The building's fate. The goshiwon building in Sinchon remained standing for several more years, but it never recovered from the notoriety of the case. Most of the rooms emptied within months. Those who remained were generally the poorest and most desperate, people like Minho had been, with nowhere else to go. The landlady position passed to a relative of Kim Ji-won's, but the building's reputation was unsalvageable. Local residents avoided it. Potential tenants read the news stories online and chose other options. By 2002, the building was condemned by the city. Safety inspections revealed structural issues and code violations that would have been prohibitively expensive to repair. In 2003, it was demolished. In its place, developers built a modern coffee shop chain and a small convenience store, symbols of Seoul's relentless march forward, of progress that swallowed the past without even noticing what it consumed. Chapter 16. The family's continuing journey. Young Mi-young's mother, Park Soo-ja, established a small scholarship in her daughter's name at Yuha Women's University. It provided funding for lower-income art students, particularly women. By 2020, it had helped more than 200 students complete their degrees. When she accepted an award for the scholarship's contributions to the arts community in Seoul, Park Soo-ja spoke about her daughter for the first time publicly since the trial. She described Jung Mi-young's talent, her kindness, her dream of becoming an artist. She cried as she spoke, but there was also an odd peace in her voice, the peace that comes from finally being able to speak openly about someone you have lost. "My daughter's life was cut short," Park Soo-ja said to the gathered crowd. "She was murdered by someone she had done nothing to harm. For years, I didn't even know what had happened to her. But through this scholarship, through these students, she will never know, but who exist because of her memory, Jung Mi-young's spirit continues. Her potential, though cut short, continues to generate potential in others." Choi Hae-jin's father, Choi Jin-soo, took a different path. He became an advocate for mental health awareness and criminal justice reform in Korea. He traveled to schools and universities, giving lectures about the dangers of untreated mental illness, about the societal shame that prevented people from seeking help. My daughter was killed by a man who was sick, Choi Jin-soo said in these lectures. That sickness was real, but the response to that sickness, hiding it, denying it, treating it as something shameful rather than medical, that response was also real, and it enabled the tragedy. He did not excuse Kim Ji-won's actions, but he contextualized them within a society that had failed both her son and his daughter. A society that said it was better to keep illness hidden than to acknowledge it. Better to let someone suffer in isolation than to admit the need for help. Part 5. Reflections Across Time. Chapter 17. 25 years later. Park Min-ho, now 48 years old, lived in a comfortable house in the suburbs of Seoul with his wife and 2 children. He had completed his degree, eventually, and found work in business administration, a career that never quite captured his passion, but provided stability. His children knew about the case, though not the full details. His daughter, Min Jin, had asked him once when she was 15 why he always carefully checked the drain in their bathroom before showering. He had given her a sanitized version of the truth, that he had once lived in a place with a serious plumbing problem, and it had left him with habits of caution. "That's weird, Dad," Min Jin had said, and returned to her studies. But she didn't know that her father sometimes woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, from dreams of dark holes and terrible smells. She didn't know that he had once turned down a job opportunity because the office was located in the Sinchon neighborhood, and he couldn't bear to spend his days so close to the site of that building. She didn't know any of it, and Min-ho was grateful for that. He had maintained contact with Lee Sang-woo over the years. They were not particularly close. Their friendship had been forged in trauma rather than natural affinity. But they maintained connection, checking in every few months, remembering the anniversary of the discovery, occasionally meeting for meals where they didn't speak much about the case because there was nothing left to say about it. Lee Sang-woo had become a sociology professor at a minor university, still researching institutional failures and social systems. He remained unmarried, his relationships brief, his life oriented around his work in a way that Min-ho sometimes found sad. "Don't you want a family?" Min-ho asked him once. Sang-woo was quiet for a long time. "I don't know if I could protect a family," he said finally. "I know too much about how easily systems fail, how easily people are swallowed by circumstances, how easily tragedy can emerge from ordinary buildings and ordinary people." Min-ho understood, though he didn't entirely agree. Yes, the world was darker than most people admitted, but darkness did not negate the value of light, of family, of connection, of the small human acts that pushed back against entropy and chaos. Chapter 18. Return to the site. On a clear November afternoon, Min-ho found himself driving through Sinchon. He hadn't been to the neighborhood in over 15 years. The changes were dramatic and depressing in equal measure. The goshiwon building was gone, replaced by a coffee shop and convenience store that looked identical to thousands of other such establishments in Seoul. He parked his car and walked to the spot where his old room had been. Through the glass storefront of the coffee shop, he could see customers sitting at tables, working on laptops, chatting with friends. They had no idea what had stood here before. They had no idea what had soaked into the soil beneath their feet. Should he tell them? Should he speak to the store manager and explain that people had died in this location? That their coffee shop was built atop a tomb? Of course not. This was Seoul. The city had already moved on. The past was being aggressively erased in service of the future. Min-ho closed his eyes and tried to remember the building as it had been. The cracked walls, the yellowed tiles, the smell of mold and stagnant water. He tried to remember the faces of Jung Mi-young and Choi Hye-jin from the newspaper photos. He whispered an apology into the wind, for not discovering the crime earlier, for moving into their burial place, for surviving when they had not. Chapter 19. The Nature of Guilt. Over his years of therapy that had cost him thousands of dollars but that he considered essential to his survival, Min-ho had come to understand something about guilt. Guilt, he learned, comes in several types. There was the guilt of direct culpability, the guilt a murderer feels. This was not his guilt. There was the guilt of responsibility, the guilt someone feels when they have failed in a duty or obligation. This, too, was not quite his guilt, though elements of it appeared. What Min-ho felt was something closer to survivor's guilt, mixed with a guilt of bearing witness. He had seen something that others were spared from seeing. He had become the vessel of a truth that the world would have preferred to leave hidden. "Is that fair?" Dr. Lee had asked him during one session. "That you bear this burden?" "I don't know if it's fair," Min-ho said, "but it's the truth. Someone has to carry it." The families carry it. The city carries it, even if it doesn't acknowledge that. And I carry it because I was the one who opened the drain. You could have walked away, Dr. Lee pointed out. If you had not pursued the question of the hair, if you had not met Sang-woo, if you had not gone to the library, you could have lived in ignorance. But I didn't, Minho said, and I don't regret it. As difficult as this has been, as much as it has haunted me, I think the truth needed to be known. I think the families needed to know. I think society needed to know. Dr. Lee nodded. Then perhaps your guilt is not about the outcome, but about the process, about the distress that being a witness caused you. Perhaps, Minho agreed. Chapter 20. The Persistence of Memory. 25 years after the discovery, Minho compiled an oral history of the case for a documentary project. The director, a young woman named Choi Ji-ho, who had been in high school when the case broke, was interested in how Seoul had changed, how institutions had responded to the tragedy, what lessons had been learned. The interviews with Minho were lengthy, 3 sessions totaling nearly 8 hours of footage. He discussed his original concerns about the drain, the investigation he and Sang-woo had conducted, the moment of discovery, the confrontation with Kim Ji-won, and the years of aftermath. Do you think the case changed anything? The director asked him. In some ways, Minho said. The police developed better protocols for following up on missing persons reports. Universities started providing more resources for low-income students in goshiwons. There was a small push toward mental health awareness and destigmatization of psychiatric treatment. But, the director prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. But fundamentally no, Minho said. There are still goshiwons in Seoul. There are still poor students living in inadequate conditions. There are still people with untreated mental illnesses, families struggling without resources, a society that treats certain problems as something to hide rather than address. The case didn't change these fundamental realities. It just made them visible for a moment, and then the visibility faded. That sounds disheartening, the director said. It is, Minho admitted. And yet, I don't know what the alternative is. Should I have stayed silent? Should I have left the truth hidden? What would that have accomplished? Perhaps nothing, the director said. Or perhaps the meaning is not in whether things changed, but in the fact that you tried, that you bore witness. Chapter 21. The Sound of Water. The one thing that had never changed, even with therapy, even with time, was Minho's response to the sound of running water. Any sound of water, a faucet turned on, a toilet flushing, rain on the roof, sent a spike of adrenaline through his system. His heart would begin to race. He would find himself tensing, bracing against some anticipated horror. His wife had learned to warn him when she was running a bath or shower. His children had been told, obliquely, that Dad didn't like loud water sounds, and please try to be quiet when using the bathroom. It was a minor thing, a quirk that most people in his life accepted and accommodated, but it was also a permanent scar, a physical manifestation of the trauma he carried. On nights when Minho couldn't sleep, and there were still many such nights, he would sometimes lie in the dark and listen to the building around him. The plumbing in his house was modern and efficient, making sounds very different from the goshiwon's aging pipes. But his mind would sometimes translate those sounds into something else. He would imagine he was lying in room 302, listening to the drain in the dark, hearing in that sound the voices of 2 dead women trying to speak. These experiences had become less frequent over the years, but they never entirely stopped, and Minho had come to accept that they never would. Chapter 22. Kim Ji-won's Prison Years. The documentary also included an interview with Kim Ji-won, now 88 years old, filmed in the correctional facility where she had spent the past 25 years. She was a ghost of herself, diminished, hollowed out, her eyes unfocused. The prison psychiatrist indicated that she had been dealing with severe depression and trauma symptoms for most of her incarceration. When asked about her son, Kim Ji-won's response was minimal and flat. He was sick. The system failed him. I failed him. There is nothing more to say. When asked about her victims, she broke down. She wept. The deep, chest-heaving sobs of someone who had been holding pain in suspension for decades, and spoke about the families she had wronged, the lives she had allowed to be destroyed, the evil that her son had committed, and that she had enabled by her silence. I don't expect forgiveness, she said between gasps. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I think about them. Every day, I hear them in the sounds of the prison, in the pipes, in the water running. I hear them, and they are angry. as they should be. The documentary presenter asked if she had had contact with the families of the victims. Kim Ji-won shook her head. They tried once, many years ago. They came to the prison. I couldn't face them. I didn't have the right to face them. How do you look into the eyes of people whose daughters you allowed to be murdered? How do you explain that you chose your son's comfort over their daughters' lives? She had no answer to those questions. The camera captured her sitting in silence, tears running down her withered face, her hands shaking in her lap. Chapter 23. The Cycle Continues. The documentary, titled What Came Out of the Drain, premiered at a film festival in Seoul in 2023 and was later released on a streaming platform. It generated renewed interest in the case, particularly among younger Koreans who had no personal memory of it. Social media discussions emerged about the case, about systemic failures, about the ways that poverty and mental illness intersected to create conditions for tragedy. Some people advocated for Kim Ji-won's release, arguing that she had served enough time, that her punishment had been excessive given her son's role in the actual crimes. Others argued that her punishment had been insufficient, that she should have been sentenced to life imprisonment, that her complicity in the murders was equal to the act of murder itself. Park Soo-ja, Jung Mi-young's mother, who was now in her 80s, agreed to an interview for the documentary. She spoke about receiving a letter from Kim Ji-won's lawyer decades earlier, an attempt at apology and explanation. She had never opened the letter fully, she said. She had only held it, and then burned it. I didn't want her explanations, Park Soo-ja said on camera, her voice steady though her hands trembled. I didn't want to hear about her suffering or her guilt. My daughter was dead. That was the only relevant fact. Everything else was just noise. Yet, when asked if she could ever forgive Kim Ji-won, Park Soo-ja surprised the interviewer, and perhaps herself, by hesitating. I forgave her a long time ago, she said finally, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I couldn't carry the anger anymore. It was eating me from the inside. So I forgave her for myself, not for her. And I think about her sometimes. I think about her in that prison cell, alone, hearing the same sounds in the pipes that my daughter heard. That seems like its own kind of hell. Chapter 24. The Meaning of Discovery. As Min-ho aged, his perspective on the case shifted. The guilt that had dominated his 20s and 30s gave way to something more complex, a kind of witness consciousness, a sense of having been present for something important, even though that importance had not translated into major change. He came to think of the discovery as a kind of responsibility that had been placed on him without his consent. He had not asked to find the truth. He had not volunteered to be the instrument through which two families would finally get closure. But he had been placed in that position by circumstance, and he had risen to meet it, and now he carried it. In some ways, this was harder than guilt. Guilt at least suggests complicity, some degree of choice or responsibility that could theoretically be absolved. But this was simply the weight of knowing. There was no absolution for that. There was only the continuing practice of bearing it. Min-ho donated anonymously to both the Jung Mi-young Scholarship Fund and to a mental health awareness organization that Choi Jin-soo had helped establish. These donations were small, amounts his comfortable but not wealthy life could accommodate, but they represented his attempt to transform the tragedy into something generative, to allow it to create positive change in the world. He also mentored a young university student who was studying criminology and had expressed interest in cases of institutional failure. He spent several hours a month with the student, discussing the case, the investigation, the trial, the aftermath. "Why are you so willing to relive this?" the student asked him once. "Because I think if I don't speak about it, if people like me who lived through it remain silent, then the case becomes a curiosity. An interesting true crime story," Min-ho said. "But if we speak, if we contextualize the tragedy within the systems that enabled it, then maybe something actually does change. Maybe not in a measurable way, but maybe in the consciousness of someone like you, who will go on to work in criminal justice or victim advocacy or some related field. So you're trying to change things?" the student asked. "I'm trying," Min-ho said. "I don't know if I'm succeeding, but I'm trying." Epilogue. The Persistence of Drains. Chapter 25. 2024. Still Haunting Park. Min-ho is now 49 years old. His daughter is in university, studying literature. His son is in high school, already showing signs of becoming a scientist. His wife, who he married at 32 after several relationships that didn't survive his periodic bouts of insomnia and psychological distress, is a translator of foreign literature. They live in a well-maintained house in Bundang, in the suburbs. The house is modern, with good plumbing, with efficient drainage systems that work without sound or drama. Minho still checks the bathroom drains regularly. It is a habit now, so ingrained that he does it without conscious thought. Every morning, before work, he visually inspects the drains in his house. He cleans them with attention and care. He maintains them obsessively. His wife has learned not to comment on this anymore. She understands that it is not about hygiene or maintenance. It is about control, about the attempt to prevent a recurrence of chaos, about managing the relationship between the visible and the hidden. Late at night, when he cannot sleep, Minho sometimes reads news stories about missing persons cases. He reads about institutions failing, about families searching desperately for closure, about cold cases gathering dust in police databases. He writes emails sometimes, never sent, to the families of these missing people. He writes to tell them that he understands the not knowing, the agonizing uncertainty. He writes to tell them that sometimes the truth does emerge, though it may take years, and that the emergence is both relief and devastation. These emails remain in his drafts folder indefinitely. He will never send them. But the act of writing them seems to provide some release, some channeling of the empathy he carries for people he has never met, and situations he is fortunate not to be in. Chapter 26. The Building That Remains. Somewhere in Seoul, there exists a building that has not changed. Not the goshiwon, that is gone, but another building, older and more famous, sits in a neighborhood that has become somewhat gentrified, but still carries echoes of what it once was. This building, 3 stories, concrete and brick, stands with its secrets intact. It houses apartments now instead of goshiwons. The residents who live there do not know the history of what happened in the building. They know only that the rent is slightly cheaper than comparable apartments, and they wonder sometimes, in the way that everyone wonders, why that might be. If someone were to tell them the story, they would likely shake their heads in sympathy and then move on with their lives. But the building knows. The pipes know. The drains know. Somewhere in the plumbing system, perhaps in areas that have never been fully excavated, perhaps in spaces that remain undiscovered, there may still be traces, tiny fragments of bone perhaps, a few remaining hairs, preserved by chemistry and darkness. These traces will never be found. The building will eventually be demolished, like all buildings eventually are in a city as restless as Seoul. And when it is demolished, the traces will be crushed to dust and mixed back into the earth and the city, indistinguishable from all the other dust and debris. But in that instant before demolition, in that moment when the building's secrets are about to be lost forever, perhaps some remnant of awareness will persist. Perhaps Young Young's spirit, whatever that means, will know that her remains are about to be scattered. Perhaps Choi Hye-jin's ghost, if such things exist, will feel the ending approaching. Or perhaps not. Perhaps consciousness ends with death, and all that remains is biology, chemistry, the slow decomposition of matter in the dark. Either way, the building stands, and it waits, and in its pipes, water flows, carrying with it the memory of what once happened here. Chapter 27. A Final Reflection. Park Min-ho, standing now in the autumn of his life, has come to believe that the meaning of his experience lies not in the discovery itself, but in the continuing witness to it. He was not the murderer. He was not the victim. He was not even the perpetrator's mother, burdened by the impossible choice of maternal love versus justice. He was simply the man who opened the drain, a man in the right place at the right time to uncover the wrong thing. And because he was in that place, at that time, the truth emerged. And because the truth emerged, families were able to grieve. And because families were able to grieve, the city was forced to confront its failures. These are small things, perhaps. Small in the scope of human history. Small even in the scope of Seoul's tragedy. But they are real. They matter. They ripple forward into time, in ways that cannot be predicted or fully comprehended. Minho has come to accept that this will be his life's mark, not achievements in business or family, though those matter, but the fact that he once asked a question about a drain, and in asking that question, changed the course of multiple lives. On nights when he hears water running through the pipes of his modern suburban house, Minho sometimes pauses and listens, and in that sound, he hears not screams or cries, but simply water, simply the function of plumbing, the necessary movement of waste through hidden channels, the background infrastructure of modern life. The ghosts, if they were ever there, have moved on. The trauma, if it still exists, has been so fully integrated into his consciousness that he can no longer separate it from the rest of who he is. He is the man who opened the drain, and he will carry that knowledge to the end of his life. And after his life, the knowledge will pass on to his children, not the specifics, perhaps, but the understanding that beneath surfaces lie depths, that drains and pipes are not innocent, that the city itself is a kind of tomb, housing multiple histories of loss. This knowledge is a burden, but it is also strangely a kind of grace.